In an earlier lecture, I reviewed the pioneering research of Hermann Ebbinghaus on memory, Ebbinghaus who used nonsense syllables, consonant, vowel, consonant trigrams, so as to be sure that subjects in studies of memory did not have built-in prior associations with the stimulus material. Since there had been no exposure to nonsense syllables in the past, Ebbinghaus was able to show the growth of memory with exposure and, in fact, the decline of memory with the passage of time, and this became paradigmatic for memory studies throughout much of the early part of the 20th century. But Ebbinghaus himself understood, as we all understand, that indeed most settings in which we are going to be forming memories are contextually rich and depend very much on a whole history of associations and very, very seldom involve materials that are either ambiguous or nonsensical. We all know that the likelihood we're going to recall an event increases as the vividness of that event or the signal nature of that event, the significance of the event, increases. Throughout the ages, people have taken advantage of these facts. Indeed, before written records became common in early medieval Europe, the way you guaranteed that the community would always remember the day in which Jack and Jill pledged each other their troth was that at the wedding feast you'd find the youngest children who were still conscious, sensible children. You'd find the youngest ones you could, and you'd ply them with sweets, and you'd give them little wooden toys, and you'd make a great show of interest and affection, a really unnaturally great show of interest and affection, so that for as long as they lived, they would remember that on a date certain, these two people actually got married. You were using, in this case, the vividness of a pattern of rewards. I should tell you that there's a macabre version of this also, instances in which contractual agreements, not written now, but contractual understandings between parties would be witnessed by young children who then might have a limb dipped in a very hot oil or otherwise something that was extremely painful. So as long as they lived, they would never forget that John and Bill agreed to exchange property. Well, this just to point out that the folk psychology of the ages recognizes a strong connection between the formation of durable memories and a contextually rich setting that provides a marker or a place to locate this experience in. Now, some of these extremely vivid events form what psychologists have called flashbulb memories. I should think most people, surely most people of the right vintage, know exactly where they were and what they were doing on the day they heard that President Kennedy had been shot. And that's what's meant by a flashbulb memory. This sudden fact appears on the screen of consciousness with such extraordinary vividness that not only is it remembered all the days of one's life, but it seems to carry with it all of the contextual associations of the moment, so that I can speak for myself. I had a research position at Columbia University at the time, and I can picture myself to this day sitting at my desk and the telephone ringing and the person on the other end saying, "Have you heard President Kennedy was shot?" It's like, we use this expression, don't we? It's like it was yesterday, when a memory is that vivid. And everyone attending to these lectures has had an experience of such salience and vividness that you just know you're never, ever going to forget it. And this is utterly different, it seems, from what it was Ebbinghaus was studying. In Ebbinghaus's studies, if you take a look at recall for nonsense syllables a day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days later, you see something that very much fits the model of the decaying memory trace. With the passage of time, there's ever less successful recall, which is not true of these so-called flashbulb memories, and this, we think, because context is such a vital ingredient in the preservation of memory over long stretches of time. But of course, salience and vividness provide something of a two-way street. It's very often the case that when our emotions are excited, when we are driven up to the highest levels of attentiveness and arousal, we may actually, quote, remember, close quote, things that might not have been present at all. That is, where the flood of information is great, including information arising from our own visceral and affective emotional responses to a situation, we may misperceive and miss in our recollections of events. This surfaces quite famously in cases of eyewitness testimony, and some of these eyewitness situations have been reduced to experimental protocols where you can actually show a court how defective memory might be when it's formed under emotionally charged conditions. Of course, psychologists are constantly plaguing undergraduates with these mocked-up experiments, often the student having no idea what the point of the experiment is. If we were doing that in this recording studio, and if I had a sinister nature, which I do not, I might have contrived the following. In the middle of my lecture, and entirely unannounced, someone bursts into the room, shouts 2 or 3 epithets at the person manning the camera, and says, "And I told you I was going to get you and I will," and with that storms out of the door. And then, once we get over our shock and amazement, I get out a list of questions and I start asking those present, would you describe the assailant? Write down what you take to be the height, weight, gender, complexion, hair color, eye color, dress, pitch of voice, and so forth. You would be amazed at how various the reports would be. You would be amazed at how firmly those who turn in reports entirely at variance with the event stick to their account of the event. And they're not doing so out of considerations of pride or funky stubbornness. They're doing so because, in fact, the event was absorbed into a larger framework, what might be called something of a narrative framework. My goodness, we were just put upon by someone, behaving in a most menacing way. And this now ties in with all sorts of notions about the kinds of people who do things like that. And this comes to shape the recollections that we have. So although eyewitness testimony is direct testimony, in a way that, for example, fingerprints on a murder weapon will not constitute, direct evidence, will not constitute direct evidence, eyewitness, quote, evidence can be of an entirely spurious nature, and experiments have been done that make that quite clear. I should tell you in this connection that sometimes law enforcement agencies, perhaps more driven by passion than by reason, have actually used these tendencies for purposes that are not entirely laudable. There's one textbook concerned with psychology and law that shows the police lineups used in one small, sleepy southern village in order to get eyewitness accounts to identify culprits and perpetrators. And one photograph that lasts in my own mind, it's almost a flashbulb memory, is this. The only thing the eyewitnesses to the crime knew was that the perpetrator was black. And we're now given in this textbook a photograph of the police lineup that was actually presented to the eyewitnesses. And there were 3 Caucasian women, 1 Caucasian male, all of them well over 50, and then the young black in the photograph, in the lineup, was about 18 years old and clearly black, was there. And your task was is there anyone in this lineup that you identify as being the perpetrator of the crime? And of course, the only thing known is that the crime had been committed by a young black fellow. So this is a foolproof system for getting eyewitness-based convictions, and it's something that we have to guard against all the time. Now, also in an earlier lecture, I mentioned that we use mnemonic devices in order to organize our memories and to make them far more prodigious than they otherwise would be in Ebbinghaus memory drum fashion. The mnemonic that I mentioned was one associated with memorizing the 12 cranial nerves found in the human brain. On old Olympus, towering tops, a Finn and German viewed some hops. The first letter of each of those words then gives you the first letter of the cranial nerve, and indeed it gives you the cranial nerves in their order of occurrence from the most anterior to the most posterior. That's an example of a mnemonic. It's a fairly meaningful one in that this little rhyme scheme here actually seems like something going on. On old Olympus towering tops, a Finn and German viewed some hops. This is not a great saga. It's not of epic proportions, but there's something of a story being told. And this tells us something about mnemonics in general. We remember better and better those events that we can incorporate into some sort of narrative account. If we can make a story out of it, we're much better at recalling the details than we otherwise would be. And again now, in keeping with recent lectures, we begin to see something very mental, quite cognitive, narrative, as underlying a process that in strict empiricistic fashion might simply seem to be events in the external world. These are events in the external world that become absorbed into something very much in the interior of our lives, namely a narrative account, a meaningful story, something that renders the otherwise buzzing confusion of the external world intelligible to us. Pre-literate societies have a particular memory problem facing them. I talk about societies that do not yet have a written language. How are they to recall all of the important functions, ceremonies, rituals, events, birth dates, death dates, marital agreements, and all that, exchanges of property, and there are no written documents at all? Well, anthropologists have done studies of contemporary pre-literate societies, and of course we've got the extraordinary record of the epic poetry of the pre-literate Greek-speaking world, the Homeric world, and we begin to see that epic poetry, not to mention dances and choruses and songs, become the means by which, in the absence of language, all sorts of details of life, understandings, laws and principles, basic functions, family responsibilities, hierarchies within the tribe, all of the great, great deeds performed by the heroes and the like, become part of the living memory of the surviving members and in a form that can be passed on to successive generations. There isn't any doubt but that blind poet Homer, whose name means hostage, was composing something to be recited over the evening fire by members of small communities who wanted to steel the resolve of their young children and give them images they would never forget. The picture of Diomedes turning on Aphrodite herself and wounding a goddess, who then must go back to Zeus and be healed by the touch of his hand. Who can ever forget a scene like that, where Diomedes, overcome by the wolf's rage, Lusa, now loses all rationality, all restraint, and does the worst thing imaginable, opposes physically the intentions of a god, in this case a goddess. Can you imagine the little 7- or 8-year-old hearing about this as the fire flickers away and as the teller of the tale raises an eyebrow and casts a deep glance and issues forth with statements at once foreboding and portentous and feeding an imagination? Well, this, of course, is something that's done with children to this very day. And memories are being built up for which words will later find yet another means of representation. Of course, once you absorb something into a narrative framework, you run all the risks the storyteller runs. Namely, you might come up with something extremely interesting, which is nonetheless utterly untrue. And there are even games that we've put together. The game of telephone is a wonderful instance of this, and psychologists who want to get publications don't play the game of telephone, but they engage in something called rumor studies. And the good way to do a rumor study, if you get a bunch of chums together, you could do this at a party with 12 or 15 people. Here's the way the game is played. You take some fact, And we'll give the fact a few details. Let's try to make one up right here. What I'm going to do is pick out somebody in the party, pick out one of the 15 people, and I will whisper the following into that person's ear. There's someone in this room who arrived somewhat late and breathing quite deeply, complaining of having some difficulty finding a parking space, and showing up actually with a pen that had no ink in it, and therefore unable to take notes. Pass it on. So that person now whispers it to another person, and that person whispers it to another person. And this iteration goes on until the 15th person has been given the tale. Now, I've done this in classrooms with stories like that, and when you then ask the 15th person to stand up and say what happens, it goes something like this. When I spilled ink on myself this morning, because I had to go to the cleaner to have the stain removed, I was late getting to class, and I ran up a flight of stairs, and my teacher was absolutely breathless. Now, if you say to the person, are you fairly sure that's what you were told? And by the way, you ask the 14th person to write down what it is that person is saying to the 15th. Well, the 15th is quite clear. This is the right narrative. It's the story that was told to me. Now you read what the 14th had to say. Well, of course, you can see at each junction the transformations taking place in this account. And so by the time you, and there's no doubt in anyone's mind that if you actually kept this going on and on and on, by the 24th person, the 30th person, the 80th person, there might be absolutely no connection at all between what the 80th person is standing up and saying about some flame swallower at the circus who then stuck an octopus and had ink running all over the. You see, you'd get absolutely no connection whatever. So in our narrative modes of memory, we very often put together stories that are not merely preservative in their function, but they are constructivist in their function. And I refer here to what psychologists sometimes call constructive memory. This is where, in an attempt to recover an earlier event, you actually reconstruct it, but not inevitably faithfully. One illustration of this has a person being shown the picture of a room. And it's a room with a chair and a desk, perhaps a typewriter and a lamp and a clock, and shelves on which are located little Hummel statues and things like that. Now, at an appropriate interval, the next day or an hour later, you ask the person, were there any books in the room? Yes. By the way, there weren't any books in the room. Was there paper on the desk? Yes. Was there a pen on the desk? Yes. And this is not some sort of faded recollection, I think so, maybe there was. This is a vivid, almost pictorial recollection of an event. Now, when you start debriefing people, when you actually show them the photograph of the original scene and they see there were no books on the shelf, well, then they quite agree. Ah, well, a typewriter, it's obviously a study. There were bookshelves. What do you ordinarily expect to see in bookshelves? Books. It's not a memorial process. It is a constructivist narrative kind of process in which you fill in the blanks. And memory mechanisms are such, and cognitive processes are such, that where gaps occur, I'm inclined to say this is something of a gestalt process, a goodness of fit, a goodness of form, where you find these gaps, you do fill them in. And you don't fill them in with random content, you fill them in with what is narratively the right kind of content. You make a story if you can make a story. Do you see? The narrative has to work. And when the narrative really works, it's entirely credible, which is why during the debriefing you're satisfied that indeed you did get it right. Well, of course, all the pieces do fit together. I needn't alert you to, particularly in the age in which we live, to the difficulties that arise when adults, 20, 15, 12 years after an event that is a traumatic event, are asked to recall the actual episodes in which in childhood they were abused sexually by others, by members of the family and the like. How are these accounts to be understood? Are they to be understood as true, vivid, accurate retellings of something that happened? Does constructive memory have free rein in a domain like this? If there are gaps and ambiguities, might there be a tendency not to lie, but to compose and construct a narrative that will have the whole thing hang together, but now hang together by the lights of an adult telling a story about a childhood only whose fragments are recalled? There is the horrific fact of child abuse, the sexual abuse of children, how an age can host this conduct without shaming itself daily beggars the imagination itself. But there also are instances in which utterly innocent persons have been successfully convicted of things they didn't do on the basis of memorial reconstructions that seem to follow the very, very pattern that I've described under the heading of constructive memory. The last words are not in on this. Stephen Cecchi, a noted psychologist, has studied the reports of children, their ability to put these things together. He is not skeptical about the fact of the sexual abuse of children. He is concerned, and his research warrants concern on the part of all of us, as to the degree to which these ex post facto accounts, sometimes taking place decades later, really should be treated as the equivalent of a kind of eyewitness testimony. So there is all that to concern itself with. Now, alas, things go wrong with memory. We've even been able to isolate places within the brain that operate selectively on different kinds of memory. We know, for example, that in the subcortical regions of the brain underneath the cerebral cortex, below the cerebral cortex, notably the hippocampus, that these regions are centrally involved in storing information from the past. And some of these areas have been targeted by disease and give rise to absolutely chilling consequences. Let me report one of them that's especially chilling and that I had an opportunity to observe some years ago. One of the world's authorities on the music of losses is the English conductor Clive Wearing. And a number of years ago, Clive Wearing, in the prime of life, very successful in having his group of singers record and sell the music of losses and the like, Clive Wearing was the victim of an encephalitis that attacked the temporal cortex on both sides, a bitemporal encephalitis, which implicated, of course, the hippocampus is within the core of the temporal lobes, which implicated the hippocampus on both sides of the brain. The result of this is something that almost exceeds the capacity of the imagination. Clive Wearing has a memory that will not reach back further than a minute or a minute and a half. That is, this is a person who will spend the rest of his life seeking to rediscover himself just about every minute of every hour of the day. He allowed himself to be filmed. The film clip of Clive Wearing shows up in a wonderful PBS, British Broadcasting documentary called The Mind, and the first program in that series is called The Search for Mind, and we thought it was particularly apt to feature Clive Wearing here because here is someone searching for his own mind minute by minute. Now, Clive Wearing's wife visits him daily, of course, and is one of the most poignant figures, a person of extraordinary character and goodwill and intelligence and commitment. When she visits her husband, the first thing she notices, of course, is that his bed in hospital is covered with notes. What are these notes of? This is Clive Wearing recording minute by minute everything that's going on in his life. The orange juice was brought in, the nurse brought the daily newspapers and the like. Of course, when he consults those notes, he has no recollection of having made them. And if he is told, as he is told by a loving wife, but Clive, do you not recognize this as your handwriting? He becomes extremely agitated. he becomes even abusive. "You stupid woman. Of course I recognize that this handwriting is my handwriting. What I'm telling you is I didn't write it." And you can sense the agitation, the foment within him. This is a person who is constantly frustrated by the facts of life that never can be knitted together into a narrative. He cannot continue the story of his life because the segments available to him are a minute long. Now, if Mrs. Waring comes into the room, you see an almost explosive greeting. He looks up and he sees her and he says, "Darling," and he gives her a firm embrace, and he's obviously overjoyed by the fact of her presence. And they talk away for a few minutes and the like. She leaves the room, and she can count to 30 seconds. And if she re-enters the room, it is precisely the same greeting all over again. It's as if he were meeting her for the first time, but at some level still knows her in an intimate and loving way. And on every encounter, you get just this explosive, hyper-emotional greeting, this hyper-emotional responsivity, do you see? Now, how are we to understand this? Well, memory is a quite complex phenomenon. That's the understatement of today's lecture. There are emotional memories. I want to use that term. I don't even want to suggest anything cognitive. There are certain memories which, as it were, form part of what the body itself knows and recalls. Here's a person who has been intimately and lovingly associated with the person who will always be the best friend he ever will have had in life. And every cell in his body, in a manner of speaking, recognizes the presence of this person. And it's this emotional response, this sort of, if I can use a technical term, sort of limbic level of responding that is guiding memory here. He knows it's his wife. He knows he loves her. How wonderful to see her again. Of course, at the cognitive level, there's very, very little in their conversations that he can knit together at all. And if she leaves the room for a minute and comes back in, whatever it was they were talking about is entirely lost to him. Well, if it is the case that memory can be stored, as it were, at non-cognitive levels, or at least at not obviously reachable levels, stored somewhere in wherever these things get stored, then one question that becomes interesting is, how will Clive Waring do when it comes to music? Well, arrangements were made to have Clive Waring regroup with the performers that he had directed with such eminence and success for a period of years. He has a vague recollection of music being somewhere in his background. He seems to be able to handle musical notation and the like, but only events from the remote past could he speak about at all. Anyway, into the place he comes. It's a church. Doesn't really know much about what's expected of him. Walks over to the keyboard. He's asked if he'd like to sit at the piano. The group is there. They're very happy to see him again. They give him a warm greeting. He recognizes their faces. He's quite happy to see them too. He sits at the keyboard, and there's music set up there, and he looks at it, and the group says it's prepared to perform if he'd like to do something, whereupon he hits the first chord of the Losses piece and raises his hand and proceeds to conduct them as he plays flawlessly through this significant work of late medieval music. Now, the piece, of course, runs for more than an hour. Runs for more than a minute. And indeed, some of these pieces would run to an hour. And you might ask yourself, well, how can he knit together these successive musical moments when in fact he could not knit together the successive moments of a conversation, even a heated debate? And it seems to me then that the right answer to that question is that this system has coded its musical knowledge in such a way as to render it impervious to whatever it is that otherwise can attack our verbal memories, our conversational memories, our memories for mere detail and fact. I have no doubt but that Clive Waring could get on a bicycle and ride it, because here the memory is so overlearned, so thoroughly ingrained that in fact its representation within the system must be for all practical purposes everywhere, not in the hippocampus or in the temporal lobe, but wherever anything can be stored at all. It becomes a question of some interest of whether in fact Clive Waring might be encouraged to score the events of his daily life, to reduce them to a kind of musical rendition, and perhaps begin to recover the facts of daily life through the idiom that he has retained so flawlessly, even in the face of this dreadful disease.